It's great to have you join us. You're watching our mid-morning edition of Arirang News on this Monday, June 1st, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Jaein. Before we get started, here are the stories we're following at this hour. South Korea stuck between a rock and a hard place. U.S. President Donald Trump's invitation for South Korea to attend the G7 summit this fall puts Seoul in a tough spot amid the growing tensions between Washington and Beijing. The South Korean government will submit its third supplementary budget bill to Parliament this week in what's due to be the largest single extra budget in history. Rival political parties scrambling to come up with support measures for COVID-19 pandemic officially begin their first day of the four-year term. Violent demonstrations continue across major cities in the United States as protesters clash with police following the death of an African-American man, George Floyd, while in police custody in Minneapolis. South Korea recorded $35 billion of exports in May, down about 24% on-year due to the drop in global demand amid the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the Trade Ministry on Monday, despite the pandemic and 1.5 fewer business days compared to April, May's trade balance was in the black with a surplus of about $440 million. Exports and COVID-19 test kits soared by around 59%, and computer exports went up by roughly 83% on the increased demand for non-contact services. Semiconductor exports were also up by over 7%. At the nation's top office, President Moon Jae-in will be chairing a session of the Emergency Economic Council this afternoon to discuss the government's proposed third extra budget that'll be used to tackle the economic circumstances of COVID-19. His chairing of today's meeting, which comes in over a month, is likely to highlight the need for another supplementary budget aimed amid the economic crisis and to fine-tune the specifics of the so-called Korea New Deal. Another topic of this table is likely to be South Korea's economic policy direction for the second half of the year. And the government will likely submit the budget bill to the National Assembly for deliberation later this week. And South Korea's 21st National Assembly begins its duty this Monday, the first working day for lawmakers since the start of the new parliamentary term. One of the most pressing goals is approving a third COVID-19 related supplementary budget by the end of June. Members of the ruling party and the government have discussed the scale of the extra budget on this Monday morning, and the government, according to the finance minister, is aiming to submit the bill to the assembly on Thursday, June 4th, and that's likely to be the largest single budget in history. Also, rival political parties will be discussing finalizing who will fill the roles within the Assembly's standing committees today. U.S. President Donald Trump has invited South Korea and other countries to this year's G7 summit, which he said will be held in person this fall. While such a proposal underlines Seoul's elevated global profile, this could also complicate the country's diplomacy with China if Washington uses the summit to rally support for its pressure campaign against Beijing. Our Kim Hyo-sun with the details.
U.S. President Donald Trump says membership to the Group of Seven should also include South Korea, Russia, Australia, and India. Speaking to reporters on Saturday, he also said the meeting will be postponed to September, adding a new date has yet to be confirmed. He says the meeting will take place as the U.S., quote, transitions back to greatness.
The G7, the president wants to see this take place as America reopens, as we try to approach a place of normalcy where people go back to work, where people do recreational activities but socially distance while they do it. The president thinks no greater example of reopening in this transition to greatness would be the G7.
Amid the global COVID-19 pandemic, President Trump announced in March that the meeting will be canceled and the leaders would hold a video conference instead. He also explained that the current makeup of the group, which includes Canada, France, Germany, and Japan, is outdated. He also said the group does not properly represent what is going on in the world. The proposed invitation implies South Korea's enhanced international status, especially amid the pandemic. Such an expansion, however, could leave South Korea in a tough spot. especially if Washington uses the group to garner support for its campaign to increase pressure on China following Beijing's passing of the new controversial national security law that effectively clamps down on Hong Kong. This could present complications for Seoul as Chinese President Xi Jinping is scheduled to visit South Korea sometime this year. In Seoul, the presidential office is cautious about President Trump's proposal, explaining there was no prior consultation, but the allies will discuss the matter going forward. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Amid steadily rising tensions, the U.S. Secretary of State says China is using the tactical situation on the ground to its advantage, as seen with China's border with India. Speaking with Fox News, Washington's top diplomat Mike Pompeo said the Chinese Communist Party has been making such efforts for a long time and that General Xi Jinping is intent on building out his military capabilities. Pompeo added that the State Department is doing everything to make sure that it understands this threat. He also said he is confident that the U.S. national security establishment will keep it in a position to protect Americans while staying good partners with South Korea, India, Australia, and others. Hong Kong's annual vigil marking the Tiananmen Square protests could be canceled for the first time in 30 years and be broadcast online instead. On June 4th, 1989, tens of thousands of Chinese students marched to Beijing's Tiananmen Square demanding economic and political reforms, and during that process, many of them were killed by the Chinese army. This year, the vigil is expected to be blocked because the Hong Kong government has banned gatherings of more than 8 people to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The head of the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements of China said Sunday that if the vigil doesn't receive approval from police, it'll be held online Thursday from 8 to 8:30 p.m. local time. For the past 29 years, the vigil has been held annually in Victoria Park and has attracted huge crowds. Dozens of cities in the United States erupted into violent protests over the weekend, sparked by the recent death of an African-American man while in police custody in Minneapolis. Police cars and government buildings were set ablaze, while others looted stores. Our Lee Seung-jae with more.
Fires, looting, and chaos broke out in numerous U.S. cities on Saturday night as protesters clashed with police in a wave of protests sparked by the death of George Floyd, an African-American man who died last week while in police custody in Minneapolis. Police cars and government buildings were set ablaze, while others smashed storefronts and looted. The protests have expanded and become increasingly more violent for 5 days in what may be the biggest coast-to-coast demonstrations in the U.S. since the extended anti-Vietnam War protests of the 1960s. In response, Minnesota, along with 14 other state governors, called up National Guard troops. Around 5,000 were activated across the country, with another 2,000 waiting in the wings if needed. In New York City, where nearly 350 people were arrested, with dozens of police officers sustaining injuries, Mayor Bill de Blasio imposed no curfew on the city. California Governor Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency for Los Angeles, where protesters were in the streets well into Saturday night as fires raged. President Trump says his administration will stop what he called mob violence, saying such actions do not serve the interests of justice.
My administration will stop mob violence, and will stop it cold. It does not serve the interest of justice or any citizen of any race, color, or creed for the government to give into anarchy, abandon police precincts, or allow communities to be burned to the ground. Won't happen.
Nearly 1,400 people across the U.S. have been arrested, with the number continuing to grow as protests rumble on. The protests turned deadly in Indianapolis, where multiple shootings led to a death and 2 injuries. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Nightclubs, bars, and singing rooms in South Korea will be required to use QR codes to log visitors starting this month. Now, this comes as the government tightens quarantine for facilities which it deems high risk, including all nightlife establishments. The measure will be implemented across the country starting June 10th after a week-long pilot run in the capital of Seoul, int'l, and Daejeon starting this Monday. Now, the use of such a digitalized entry log could also be expanded to other multi-use facilities, including places of worship, libraries, and cinemas. Also from Monday, the 5-day rotation system imposed in South Korea to regulate the amount of protective face masks that can be sold will be lifted. That means people wanting to purchase masks will be able to do so any day of the week. The Ministry of Food and Drug Safety says the supply in the country has stabilized thanks to an increase in the daily production to 14 million face masks. Young Koreans under the age of 18 will be able to buy up to 5 masks a week as they have started or are due to restart in line with the school reopening season. Now, the rest of the population will still be limited to 3 masks a week. After reducing flights by almost 90% in March due to the COVID-19 pandemic, South Korea's aviation industry is gradually restarting their international flights. And to cope with it during these trying times, local airlines are also repurposing their fleet. Our Kim Da-mi with the details.
The Korean aviation industry is spreading its wings again. The country's national flag carrier Korean Air will reopen 13 international routes starting Monday. The routes include Washington, D.C., Seattle, Chicago, Kuala Lumpur, and Amsterdam. For the passengers' return to the skies during a global pandemic, local airlines are more geared up than ever.
From May 18, all domestic passengers are required to wear face masks, and passengers can now scan their own boarding pass before getting on the plane.
Local low-cost carriers have also hopped on the move by gradually expanding overseas routes. However, flights to China remain idle because the Chinese aviation authorities have not lifted the so-called one airline, one route restriction. The sky route's resumption also comes following a high cargo demand.
With the high cargo demand, we're temporarily expanding the number of passenger planes for carrying cargoes and the number of main routes for those planes.
In fact, by refitting some of their passenger planes to carry cargo, Asian Airlines sales of cargo outperformed sales from their passengers for the first time in March. But a revitalization of the aviation industry still heavily relies on passengers traveling. While some European countries are welcoming back foreign visitors, South Korea has extended its special travel advisory to June 19. The road back to recovering passenger demand during this pandemic may be turbulent, but local international flights are once again taking off for their passengers while satisfying new purposes and needs. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Good morning. The summer heat we saw in the central region over the weekend will ease today, hovering in the low to mid-20s, while many southern parts of the country will continue to have widespread summer warmth. The capital region woke up to wet roads this morning with some cloud coverage, but morning clouds will make way for a sunny afternoon, boosting UV levels to very high levels in most parts. Taking a closer look at today's highs, Seoul will get up to 24 degrees Celsius, Daejeon, Gwangju at 27, Gyeongju will make it to 30 degrees this afternoon. Rain is in the forecast this week across the country, so cooler than average readings in store for rain-affected regions, whereas Daegu and other rain-free regions will experience a scorching heat. In fact, Daegu will see highs above 30 degrees Celsius this week. That's Korea for you, and here's the international weather for viewers around the world.
And that is our time at this hour on Arirang News. As always, thank you for watching.